The room went silent when she didn't flinch. 3 years. That's how long Brooke Sullivan had moved through Mercy General in Denver like a ghost, asking for nothing, offering everything, her competence so quiet that the surgical residents forgot she was there 5 seconds after she left. They saw a civilian nurse in blue scrubs with tired eyes and shoulders that never quite straightened. They didn't see the senior chief petty officer who'd run forward surgical units under mortar fire in Helmand Province. They didn't see the scars that ran from her left shoulder to her right elbow like a topographic map of survival, hidden beneath long sleeves even when summer heat pressed against the hospital windows and everyone else rolled theirs up to their shoulders. What they saw was just a nurse. Just someone who organized supply cabinets with military precision, who changed dressings on burn victims without flinching when the screaming came, who moved through the ICU corridors invisible and necessary, like the oxygen that kept the machines running. The faded unit patch was sewn into the lining of her jacket, the one hanging in her locker on the 3rd floor, behind the extra shoes she never wore. Nobody knew it was there. The patch showed a trident and crossed rifles, the emblem of Naval Special Warfare Group 2, stitched with thread that had gone the color of old bone. She'd sewn it there 18 months ago, the night she'd walked away from everything, the deployments, the faces of the men she couldn't save, the weight of command that had settled into her chest and never left. The jacket had become a MacGuffin without anyone knowing, a secret sitting in plain sight between wool and silk lining. At 6:27 a.m. on a Tuesday in September, Brooke was organizing the medication dispensary in the ICU, her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent 17 years arranging field supplies in combat tents and crisis triage units. Ampoules of propofol. Syringes for fentanyl draws. Crystalloid bags ranked by expiration date. Every tool in its exact position, every movement economical, nothing wasted. Her hands were steady. They always were. Steadiness was muscle memory now, so deep it lived in her bones. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and dying flowers from the gift shop arrangements that families brought to the dying. The fluorescent lights hummed a frequency that most people heard as silence but which Brooke had learned to read like a heartbeat, the electrical pulse underneath everything, the sound of institutions trying to stay awake. She moved between the medication fridges and the crash cart, her badge clipped to her pocket, her name printed in small letters that nobody ever fully read, B. Sullivan, RN. No rank. No service record. No medal sealed in a cedar box in a storage unit 5 miles away, gathering dust and significance. At 7:15 a.m., the elevator doors opened on the ICU floor and Dr. Hargrove walked through like a man who'd never stood in a corridor that wasn't his. He was 54, with the kind of jawline that had held its shape through 3 divorces and a lifetime of scotch that tasted like oak and entitlement. His suit cost more than Brooke's monthly rent, charcoal wool with a silk tie the color of dried blood. He was talking to someone on his phone, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, heavy and unstoppable. No, the metrics are pristine, he was saying, his footsteps clicking against the tile with the rhythm of authority. 98% surgical success rate. 2% mortality. Best in the state. That's what they're going to see on the board when I walk in next month. A pause, then, exactly. I'm not risking that for some charity case hero fantasy. Nobody. He passed Brooke without looking. She was refilling the oxygen saturation monitor. She didn't look up. Looking up would mean existing in his world, and existing in his world meant becoming a problem he could solve by moving her to a different floor, a different shift, out of his view entirely. She'd learned this lesson early in civilian life. Stay small. Stay quiet. Stay useful and invisible. The invisibility was a survival mechanism now, though she'd never been good at it. 17 years of leadership didn't evaporate just because she'd traded her uniform for scrubs. But that wasn't the worst part. At 8:03 a.m., the paramedics brought in a stretcher moving faster than routine. Code activation. The call came through the intercom at 8:04, trauma alert, ICU bed 4, ETA for minutes, and the floor shifted into velocity. Brooke was already moving, already knowing that urgency had a specific weight and texture. The paramedic radio crackled with information. Male, 32 years old. Special Forces. IED blast 3 weeks prior in a combat zone she would never name aloud. Spinal trauma. Partial paralysis from T12 downward. Nerve damage too extensive for standard surgical intervention. Everyone kept saying words like catastrophic and incompatible with recovery in the tones people used when they'd already decided the ending. The stretcher came through the doors at 8:08 a.m. like a ship in a storm. Brooke saw the patient's face first, jaw clenched, eyes moving but body still, the particular terror of a warrior who'd lost the ability to fight back. She recognized that look. She'd seen it in Helmand Province, in the triage tent at FOB Shank, in the eyes of men who understood their own vulnerability for the first time and couldn't quite believe it was real. They wheeled him to ICU bed 4, and Hargrove appeared almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, this high-risk patient to arrive so he could perform the ritual of refusal. He stood at the foot of the bed with 2 senior surgical residents flanking him like lieutenants, his posture broadcast ready, his expression one of practiced concern. "Get me Chen," he said. "And Patel. And Morrison. I want this evaluated by 3 separate surgeons before anyone makes any decisions." At 9:16 a.m., Dr. Chen arrived in the ICU with the energy of a man who'd already made up his mind before he'd read a single chart. He was 46, with a kind of career trajectory that required never saying yes to anything that could be marked a failure. He reviewed the patient's imaging for 7 minutes in silence. The MRI showed the spinal cord damage in cross-section, the scar tissue where neural pathways used to be, the swelling that hadn't responded to steroids, the vertebral fractures that would require fusion work nobody had successfully done at this extent of nerve involvement. He looked at the paralyzed veteran the way someone looked at a mathematical equation that had no solution. "Liability concerns," Chen said to Hargrove in the hallway. Brooke was changing for tubing 2 beds over, close enough to hear. "He'll sue. They always do. The family will see that it's possible to operate and demand we do it, and when he stays paralyzed, we're the ones who committed malpractice. Not acceptable." He left the chart on the desk and walked out of the ICU at 9:48 a.m. without speaking to the patient. That was refusal number 1. At 10:15 a.m., Dr. Patel arrived with his rounds cart, a slight man with 30 years of orthopedic surgery and a reputation for saying things that sounded compassionate until you understood they were really just verdicts. He spent 13 minutes with the patient, asking about pain, about sensation, about what recovery might look like if by some miracle the paralysis reversed. The veteran answered in single words, his voice the texture of something that had been broken and will never quite fit back together right. Patel reviewed the neurosurgical consultation in the hallway, pulling the chart toward him with fingers that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of closure, the heaviness of delivering a verdict. "Futile," he said simply. The surgical window for meaningful intervention closed 3 weeks ago when the initial inflammation peaked. Any intervention now is exploratory at best. I won't do it. He closed the chart with a soft sound and placed it back in the rack. That was refusal number 2. Brooke felt something shift in her chest cavity, some old lever moving into position. At 11:48 a.m., Dr. Morrison appeared in the ICU with a consulting tablet and the expression of someone who'd already spent his morning fighting fires he hadn't started. He reviewed the imaging for 4 minutes. He looked at the patient for 60 seconds. He walked to the nurse's station and said to Hargrove, "Not taking this one," and then he walked out mid-consultation, his white coat flapping slightly as he pushed through the ICU doors. He didn't even close the patient's chart. Refusal number 3. The paralyzed veteran lay in ICU bed 4 and watched it happen. He understood what every refusal meant. It meant his nervous system was too damaged. It meant his future was calculated and closed. It meant the surgeons had already written the ending, and nobody was going to pick up a scalpel to try and rewrite it. That was when Hargrove called a meeting. He appeared in the surgical hallway with the presence that made the air pressure change, gathering the department heads like a general assembling his generals. Brooke wasn't invited to the meeting, but she was told about it by the OR nurse who'd stepped out early. He said nobody touches that case, the OR nurse reported at lunch, her voice low. He said the patient's a liability. He said if anyone tries to operate without his written approval, they'll lose their privileges. He's protecting the metrics. The board appointment is next month. Refusal number 4 didn't come in the form of a doctor leaving. It came as an edict from the chief of surgery, a command issued from on high with the weight of institutional power behind it. No one would touch this case. No one could. The refusal wasn't just personal anymore. It was official. But that wasn't the worst part. At 1:53 p.m., Hargrove himself appeared at ICU bed 4. The paralyzed veteran watched him approach with the wariness of someone who'd learned that authority figures didn't arrive unless they were bringing bad news. Hargrove stood at the foot of his bed in his charcoal suit with his silk tie the color of dried blood, and he said the 5th refusal out loud, where the patient could hear it, where everyone could hear it. "Your case has been reviewed by our surgical team," Hargrove said. His voice didn't contain mercy or apology. It contained the smooth certainty of a man who'd already decided the entire trajectory of another person's existence. "We've determined that surgical intervention would be inappropriate at this time. Extensive research shows that your level of spinal trauma is non-recoverable. We're recommending palliative care and pain management as your path forward. You'll be transferred to a rehabilitation facility that specializes in long-term paralysis management." 5 doctors. 5 refusals. By noon on a Tuesday, before Brooke had eaten lunch, the veteran's fate had been sealed by the institution. But the paralyzed veteran wasn't just any warrior. He was special forces. He was someone who understood that refusal wasn't finality, it was just the first round of the battle. And he saw something in the quiet nurse who'd been changing his vertubing without making eye contact, who'd adjusted his pain medication without explaining why, who'd moved around him with a precision that looked like respect instead of pity. He saw something in her hands. The kind of hands that knew how to hold people together when everything was coming apart. The kind of hands that moved like muscle memory. The kind of hands that had done things he recognized, even if he couldn't quite articulate what. And he was about to discover that those hands belonged to someone who'd never accepted a refusal in her life. Dr. Morrison entered the consultation room with the kind of energy that announced a decision already made. He glanced at the paralyzed veteran, a man whose spine looked like shattered glass on the MRI, and spent 43 seconds reviewing the films before standing. "Not mine," he said flatly. "I don't do charity cases. Find someone else." The door closed behind him like a judgment. An hour later, Dr. Patel sat across from the same imaging, her fingers tracing the trajectory of the blast damage. Spinal cord transection. Complete. She removed her glasses, pinched the bridge of her nose, and spoke with the kind of certainty that comes from 22 years of saying no to impossible odds. "Medically futile," she said into the silence. "The damage is too extensive. Surgery would be a violation of his dignity and our ethics. I won't do it." She didn't look at Brooke when she left. By noon, 5 doctors had cycled through that room. 5 refusals. The number hung in the air like a verdict. Dr. Reeves was the 4th. He examined the scans for exactly 19 minutes, Brooke timed it, watching the second hand on the wall clock drag, then turned to face the paralyzed veteran directly. "Son, what you're asking me to do would end my career. Career suicide. I'm not going to do that for you. I'm not going to do that for anyone." The clinical detachment in his voice was almost merciful, which somehow made it worse. The 5th refusal came from Dr. Hargrove himself, chief of surgery at Mercy General, whose reputation was built on a 94.7% success rate and whose upcoming appointment to the hospital board depended entirely on those metrics remaining untarnished. He appeared in the doorway with the presence of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, silver hair, tailored lab coat, the kind of jawline that had probably been handsome once before arrogance had calcified it into something harder. He glanced at the patient with the clinical distance of a man appraising property damage. "No," Hargrove said. "Not to the patient. Not to the attending. Simply no, into the void, as if the word itself were enough. No one touches this case. Not in my department. This patient represents liability we don't need and risk we don't absorb. He turned to leave, paused, then added without turning back, his prognosis is terminal mobility-wise. Any surgical intervention would be a stain on this institution's record. Understood. He left before anyone could answer. Brooke stood in the doorway of the veteran's room that evening, watching him stare at the ceiling with the kind of emptiness that comes from knowing 5 people with the power to help you have all said no. His hands lay motionless on the white sheets. She could see the calluses on his palms, identical to one she recognized from her own skin, the kind that come from rappel lines and weapon racks and 17 years of carrying someone else's burden. Morning rounds came with the packed staff meeting. 63 medical personnel crowded into the conference room. Hargrove stood at the front with a whiteboard where someone had drawn the patient's case number and vital signs. "So," Hargrove announced, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of absolute institutional power, "we have a volunteer." He looked directly at Brooke, who stood against the far wall. "Our little Florence Nightingale here has decided she wants to take this one. I'll tell you what, I'll bet $50 she quits within a week. Anyone want in on that?" Laughter rippled through the room. It wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was the sound of collective permission. 63 people suddenly authorized to see her as expendable. Brooke took one measured breath. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. A single tear escaped. She let it fall without touching her face, and then she raised her eyes to meet Hargrove's directly. "I don't quit, doctor." The room went dead silent. Her voice had dropped an octave in those 5 words, and something in that register made him falter. Just slightly. Just for a moment. His mouth tightened. He turned back to the whiteboard and wrote in large letters, "Sullivan, $50 wager." The next day, Brooke was moving through the cafeteria line at 1:17 p.m., her hands holding a tray, pasta, garlic bread, a plastic cup of orange juice. The antiseptic smell of the hospital food ward with the stale coffee aroma hanging in the air. She was thinking about the veteran's nerve response times, about whether the damage was as complete as Patel had claimed, when Hargrove walked directly past her table. The tray went down. Not tripped. Deliberately knocked. Pasta scattered across tile like an explosion. Silverware clattering. The plastic cup split, juice spreading in a wide orange arc. 30 staff members watched in synchronized silence. A few looked away. Most didn't. Brooke kneeled to clean it. She didn't say anything. Didn't cry. Didn't respond. She simply moved, her hands gathering scattered pages of a discarded chart that had fallen into the debris, her movements precise and unhurried, as if she were alone in the room. The silence stretched. She could feel Hargrove watching from his position at the salad bar, waiting for something, a word, a flinch, a moment of visible damage. She gave him nothing. 2 days later, walking the hallway toward the veteran's room, Brooke saw a patient chart on the floor. For half a second, she thought it had been dropped. Then Hargrove rounded the corner behind her, smirking, and she understood. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice a razor disguised as charm. "Or is bending over too much nursing school for you?" 3 staff members passed. 2 pretended not to see. 1 stopped and stared. Brooke took one measured breath. A single tear escaped as she bent to gather the scattered pages, watching the white folders fan across the linoleum like a broken spine. She straightened slowly, pages in hand, and met his eyes with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than this. Much worse. "I've carried wounded men twice your weight through minefields, doctor," she said quietly. "This is nothing." His eyes narrowed to slits. The smirk vanished. For the first time, she saw something flicker across his face, not anger, but the precise moment a man realized he might have misjudged who he was standing next to. He didn't respond. He walked away, pulling his phone from his pocket before he'd even rounded the corner. "I need everything you can find on Brooke Sullivan," Hargrove's voice carried back down the hallway. "References, credentials, every detail. And I mean everything. There's something she's hiding." That evening, with the hospital moving into its quieter hours, visiting time ended at 9, surgeon egos retreated to on-call rooms, the fluorescent lights buzzing their solitary hum. Brooke began her unsanctioned assessment. The veteran's room was at the end of a corridor on the 4th floor, windows overlooking downtown Denver, the 16th Street Mall glowing in the darkness below. She wasn't supposed to be there. Hargrove's order had been explicit: no treatment, no assessment, no interaction beyond basic vital monitoring. But orders, she'd learned in Helmand Province, were sometimes the voice of people who didn't understand what survival required. Margaret arrived quietly, an OR nurse in her 60s with scars on her forearms and a gait that suggested an old injury had taught her patience. She'd worked with field medics before, in a different lifetime, in a different war. She didn't ask permission. She simply helped. Brooke's hands performed the nerve mapping examination with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory burned into bone. Light touch testing at each dermatome. Pinprick sensation. Proprioception in the toes. She worked methodically down the paralyzed veteran's legs, her fingers reading information in the language of bodies, translating damage into data. Halfway through, Margaret froze. She was watching Brooke's hands move, the way they found specific landmarks, the way they anticipated the body's responses, the kind of efficiency that no civilian nursing program taught. Her breath audibly caught. "You were a combat medic," Margaret whispered. "Not a question." Brooke's hands paused for half a second. "I was a nurse. I am a nurse." "Those aren't nurse hands," Margaret said, her voice dropping further. "Those are battlefield hands. I was with the 82nd Airborne at Kandahar. I've only seen hands move like that once, from a field surgeon who'd worked in the Korengal Valley." She lifted her eyes to meet Brooke's. "Who the hell are you?" Before Brooke could answer, the alarms erupted. The sound was unmistakable, 3 sharp electronic bleats, then a continuous tone. The veteran's monitors screaming. Brooke was already moving, her limp more pronounced when she ran, adrenaline overriding the damage her left leg had sustained 3 years ago. Margaret followed. The patient was crashing. His breathing had become shallow, labored. His chest wasn't moving on the left side. Oxygen saturation dropping, 92, 88, 83. The heart rate climbing toward 140. His eyes were wide with the particular terror of someone who couldn't move and couldn't breathe. Tension pneumothorax. A pocket of air compressing his left lung. Death in minutes if not treated. No doctor on the 4th floor. The code team was 7 minutes out. She could already hear the rapid footsteps starting from the trauma bay downstairs, the overhead announcement crackling, "Code Blue, 4th floor, room for 17." She didn't wait for authorization. Her hands moved with 18 years of practice compressed into 90 seconds. A 14-gauge angiocath needle. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The landmark palpated, the skin marked, the needle inserted with one smooth motion through the chest wall. The hiss of air escaping, the sound of survival, of pressure releasing, of a body given back the space it needed to breathe. The oxygen saturation climbed. 85, 89, 94. The heart rate dropping toward normal. His breathing deepened. The veteran's eyes focused on her face, then on something visible inside her jacket collar, the faded unit patch she'd worn against her skin for 7 years, the one she'd sewn into the fabric of her jacket lining to keep it hidden, to keep it close, to keep one piece of who she'd been near her heart while she tried to be someone else. The patch had come loose during her movement. He saw it clearly now. The unit designation. The mountain symbol. His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "You're one of us." Margaret stared. The monitors beeped steadily. The veteran's color was already returning, pink replacing the gray that had been spreading across his lips. In the server room, unwitnessed and automatically flagged in red digital letters, a notification populated on the hospital's compliance system: protocol violation, emergency procedure performed by unlicensed personnel. Timestamp: 21 hours 36 minutes and 33 seconds. Location: room for 17. The documentation created itself. The evidence recorded itself. The trap, sprung by her own hands, was already closing. The veteran's chart had become contraband. Brooke kept it in a locked drawer at home, notes written in shorthand only she could decipher, spinal compression at T4 and TR5, nerve root damage accessible but not from a chart. She needed hands-on assessment. She needed to know if there was any pathway to recovery the doctors had deemed impossible, which meant she had to see him when Hargrove's surveillance system looked the other way. 3 nights she came back after her shift ended. The veteran, whose name was Marcus, had been moved to a private room on the 4th floor, Hargrove's idea, Brooke realized, to isolate him from the general population. The isolation made the after-hours visit simpler. She'd glance at the security camera in the hallway, note the blind spot created by the equipment cart someone always left near the corner, and slip inside wearing street clothes, her scrubs folded in her gym bag like camouflage. On the 3rd night, Margaret appeared in the doorway. The OR nurse was 64, had worked Mercy General for 37 years, and had seen every surgeon in this hospital rise and fall. She'd watched Hargrove climb the ladder. She'd watched him cut corners. She held a tablet in her hands, the kind the floor nurses used for documentation, but her eyes were fixed on Brooke's hands. Brooke was performing a dermatome test, a sensory mapping technique that required precision and knowledge of exactly where to apply pressure, how to read the micro-expressions in a patient's face when sensation returned or failed to return. She was working the L3 dermatome along the lateral thigh, watching Marcus's eyes, listening to his breathing, feeling for the moment when signal traveled down a path that should have been closed. Margaret froze in the doorway. Her tablet hung at her side. Brooke felt the shift in air pressure before she turned. She saw the recognition in Margaret's face, not recognition of Brooke Sullivan, the quiet nurse who kept her head down and her opinions unvoiced. Something older. Something that had no place in civilian hospitals. "You were a combat medic," Margaret said. Not a question. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was with the 82nd Airborne, Kandahar, 2009 through 2011. I've only seen field surgeons work like that." She stepped into the room and closed the door. Nobody does dermatome mapping like that unless they've had to do it in the dark with a flashlight clenched between their teeth. Brooke's hands remained perfectly steady on Marcus's leg. One measured breath. She continued the assessment, L for now, the lateral shin, pressing and releasing, watching, listening, her fingers moving with the kind of muscle memory that 10 years of civilian nursing had never touched. Her voice came out level. "How long were you at Kandahar?" 14 months. Combat medic, 2-2 infantry. You were there, weren't you? One of those places they don't talk about. Margaret moved closer, and her weathered face held something like awe. "I watched you work. Your hands. That's not something you learn in a nursing school classroom." Marcus's eyes had closed. He was exhausted from the assessment, his body finally able to rest. Brooke pulled the blanket back up to his waist and turned to face Margaret directly. She didn't shy away. She didn't explain. She simply met the woman's eyes with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. "I was Helmand Province," Brooke said. "Senior Chief Petty Officer. Forward Surgical Unit. Long time ago." Margaret nodded slowly, as if pieces she'd been holding separately for 3 days were finally clicking together. The way Brooke moved. The way she assessed risk. The way she'd pulled a man back from the edge when 5 doctors had already written him off. In the military, you didn't forget those instincts. They lived in your hands. They lived in your breathing. They lived in the way you held still when everyone else was screaming. "Does Hargrove know?" Margaret asked. "No." Brooke began documenting her findings on the tablet Margaret had brought, keeping the screen angled away. "And it needs to stay that way." "Too late for that," Margaret said quietly. She gestured at the hallway. "The protocol violation alert went out to administration 45 minutes ago. Someone flagged the medication cart access in this hallway during your shift time. Your name's on the security footage from the stairwell. She paused. Hargrove got the alert the same time I did. I came to warn you. The words landed like ordnance. Brooke's hand stopped moving. Not a tremor. Not a flinch. Just a cessation, the way a soldier stops breathing when the IED detection goes hot. How long does he have? Margaret asked, glancing at Marcus. The nerve regeneration? If he's a candidate for repair, maybe 8 weeks before permanent scarring makes it impossible. Brooke's voice had changed. Dropped an octave. Lost the careful civilian nurse cadence and picked up something harder. He needs imaging. A specialist surgeon. Someone willing to take the risk. Hargrove will burn anyone who goes near him now, Margaret said. 5 doctors already refused. The 6th one who tries will have his credentials under audit before the incision heals. They both knew the math. They both understood the system. A doctor protects his career first. A hospital protects its metrics. A military organization protects its image. The individual patient came last. It had always been last. The only variable was whether anyone was willing to break the chain. Brooke finished the documentation in silence. She saved the file, encrypted it, handed the tablet back to Margaret. Thank you for the warning. You're going to do something about this, Margaret said. Something that's going to make a lot of noise. I'm going to go home, Brooke said. And I'm going to wait for the phone to ring. The phone rang at 4:19 a.m. Brooke was already awake, she hadn't slept. She was sitting at her kitchen table with her discharge papers from the Navy spread across the surface, the ones she'd never shown to anyone, the ones that listed her service record and her commendations in bureaucratic shorthand that failed to capture what those years had actually cost. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, it said. 18 months forward surgical unit command under fire. 43 combat saves. 2 Purple Hearts. She'd kept them in a plastic folder behind the water heater. Jake didn't know they existed. Her sister didn't know. The civilian world didn't need to know. The call was from Mercy General's Human Resources Department. A woman's voice, professionally measured and apologetic. Brooke was being called in for a disciplinary meeting at 8 a.m. There had been unauthorized access to a restricted patient. There were questions about her credentialing and her employment history. It was just a meeting, the HR woman said. A chance to explain. But she might want to bring representation. Brooke hung up. She put the discharge papers back behind the water heater and began to get ready for work. The conference room on the 4th floor had a window that looked out over the Denver skyline. Hargrove was already seated when she arrived, flanking by 2 board members whose names Brooke recognized from the hospital newsletter, wealthy donors, prominent physicians, men who'd invested in Hargrove's Rise the way you invested in a stock portfolio. There was also an investigator, a woman in a charcoal suit with the kind of face that had audited 1,000 careers into ruin. Hargrove smiled as Brooke entered. Have a seat, Brooke. His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, the power underneath, barely restrained. We have some questions about your access to room for 12 during unauthorized hours. She Saturday. 1 measured breath. Hargrove slid a folder across the table. It contained security footage, time-stamped images of her in the stairwell, her name logged against the medication cart system. He had copies of her personnel file, thin as it was. 3 years at Mercy General. No prior employment history. No references beyond a clinical nursing director in San Diego who'd apparently closed her practice. Your employment file shows a significant gap, the investigator said. Between 2006 and 2019. That's 13 years unaccounted for. Where were you employed during that period? Brooke's face remained still. She looked at Hargrove, at the satisfaction in his eyes, at the way his fingers drummed against the table with the certainty of a man who'd already won. I performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization, she said. Her voice had changed. The deferential cadence was gone. What remained was clipped, precise, military. On a patient who would have died in 4 minutes without intervention. He's alive. His nerve function is salvageable if he receives proper care within the next 6 weeks. That's what you need to know. Hargrove leaned forward. You're not a doctor, sweetheart. You're a nurse who doesn't know her place. The words landed on her like shrapnel. But her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. She picked up the folder, slid it back across the table, and met his eyes with a kind of devastating calm. I've carried wounded men twice your weight through minefields. I've amputated limbs with a field knife because we didn't have supplies. I've kept 43 soldiers alive in conditions that would make you weep. This, she gestured at the folder, the table, the room, at him, is nothing. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that comes before impact. Hargrove's face flushed. His fingers stopped drumming. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably, as if he'd suddenly remembered something about her that he should have known all along. Security will escort you from the premises, the investigator said, her voice carefully neutral. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. We'll need your badge and hospital access credentials. Brooke stood. She was thinking about the faded unit patch, the Special Forces insignia sewn into the lining of her jacket, the one that had been with her through every transition. She was thinking about Jake, who had no idea his mother had spent 18 years serving under fire, who thought she was just a nurse who had suffered some kind of vague medical trauma. She was thinking about Marcus, paralyzed in room for 12, whose nerve regeneration was already counting down. She removed her badge and placed it on the table. The plastic clattered against the polished wood like a single shot fired into silence. 2 security officers appeared in the doorway. One of them was Mike Chen, who'd worked security for 5 years, who'd waved at her in the cafeteria during those 3 years she'd kept her head down and her voice soft. He wouldn't meet her eyes as she passed him. They walked her out past the nurse's station. Her colleagues were working, charting, making calls, tending to patients, and nobody looked up. Nobody met her eyes. Nobody said anything. The silence was complete. The sound of her shoes on the tile was the only noise, the only evidence that she existed at all. Her locker had been cleaned out already. Someone had done it fast, efficient, respectful in its way. Her spare shoes, the hand sanitizer bottle, the emergency snacks she kept for the 12-hour shifts. All of it was in a cardboard box, her jacket folded on top, the unit patch still sewn into the lining, still a secret, still hers. She carried the box to her car and drove home with the windows down and the radio off. The September air was still warm. The afternoon light was the color of old brass. She sat in the parking lot of Mercy General for exactly 9 minutes, staring at the building where she'd been invisible, where she'd learned to be small and quiet and safe, and where she'd failed at being any of those things anyway. Her phone began to ring. She didn't check the caller ID. She knew it was Jake. He'd been calling since noon, messages accumulating. Mom, where are you? The school counselor called about my absence. Please pick up, Mom, please. She didn't answer. Not yet. She couldn't explain what had happened because the explanation required revealing what she'd been hiding, and she didn't have words for that yet. She didn't know if she ever would. Midnight vitals check. Room for 12. The paralyzed veteran's oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. Brooke saw it first, the subtle shift on the monitor that told her everything. 68%. 64. 60. His breathing shallow, panicked, the kind of panic that only comes when the lungs know they're being crushed from inside. A tension pneumothorax doesn't announce itself gently. It arrives like a burglar in the dark, collapsing the lung, pressing the heart sideways, killing the man from the inside while machines beep their indifferent alarms. She didn't call for backup. She didn't call for authorization. She knew what Hargrove had said, touch this patient and you're finished. Finished already. Nothing left to lose. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She'd performed it 43 times in Helmand Province, 43 times in forward surgical units under fire, her hand steady while mortars shook the tent walls. Muscle memory didn't need permission. Her hands moved on their own, fingers finding the anatomical landmarks with the certainty of someone who'd done this when the alternative was watching a man die alone in the dark. 14-gauge angiocath needle. The hiss of air escaping the chest cavity as pressure released. O2 climbing immediately. 72. 78. 84. Stable. The veteran's breathing eased. His panic dissolved into exhausted relief as his lungs expanded again, oxygen finally reaching tissue that had been suffocating seconds before. The monitor steadied. Sinus rhythm. Normal rate. The crisis evaporated like it had never happened. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when the intern who'd been sleeping in the on-call room saw her stepping out of the patient's door with a used needle, gloved hands, that unmistakable expression of someone who'd just made an irreversible choice. The intern's face went white. She backed away without speaking, but her silence was louder than any alarm. By 4 a.m., Hargrove knew. By 6 a.m., he was making calls. Brooke's sparse nursing resume lay open on his desk while he dialed numbers with the precision of someone calling in favors, his voice measured, professional, the kind of voice that could destroy a person while sounding reasonable about it. He contacted the references she'd listed. A clinical supervisor in San Diego. A department head in Oakland. Each conversation the same. Have you ever seen unusual procedural choices? Any incidents? Any instability? The implication clear without being stated, I'm hunting for evidence. Feed me ammunition. At 7 a.m., an outside investigator arrived at Mercy General, a woman with sharp eyes and a file folder that seemed to grow heavier as the morning progressed. She interviewed staff. She reviewed security footage. She pulled every protocol violation report from the past 3 years, cross-referenced Brooke's shifts, built a timeline with the mechanical precision of someone building a case. By 8 a.m., Brooke was suspended pending review. The administrator handed her the suspension letter himself, avoiding eye contact. 24 hours for the investigation to complete. 24 hours until they decided if the woman who'd saved a man's life deserved to keep her job or if protocol mattered more than outcomes. She knew the answer already. Protocol always won. Protocol was safe. Protocol protected careers. 48 hours later, at a disciplinary hearing in a conference room with 4 board members and 1 stone-faced investigator, Dr. Hargrove presented his case like he was arguing to a jury. The needle decompression violated 9 specific hospital protocols. The patient was never informed. The procedure was performed without authorization. Brooke had endangered both the patient and the hospital by acting outside the standard of care. She was a liability. A risk. Someone who couldn't follow basic rules. Brooke sat across from them in scrubs she'd changed into for the last time, her hands folded on the table, and said nothing. The administrator read from a paper, effective immediately, your employment is terminated. Your nursing license will be reviewed by the state board. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. There was no congratulations for saving a life. No acknowledgement that the veteran would be dead if she hadn't acted. No mention of the fact that she'd succeeded where 5 doctors had refused. Just the clinical, efficient erasure of a person from an institution that no longer needed her. Security escorted her down the hallway at 2 p.m. on a Thursday. Past the nurses' station where Margaret looked away. Past the break room where she'd spent 3 years making terrible coffee and listening to other nurses complain about shifts. Past the staff board with the rotation schedule that no longer included her name. Her badge clattered into a plastic bin. Her locker key, exchanged for an empty cardboard box that held a coffee mug and a stethoscope she'd bought with her own money. The colleagues who'd watched Dr. Hargrove throw her patient chart didn't look at her now. The ones who'd seen him knock her tray to the floor kept their eyes on their screens. The mask of invisibility she'd worn for 3 years had simply solidified into something else, something that made her difficult to see even as she walked past them. Rain hammered Denver that evening. She drove through it without purpose, wipers struggling against the deluge, the city dissolving into grey shapes and red taillights. She didn't know where she was going until the cemetery gates appeared. Even then, she almost drove past. But her hands turned the wheel, and her body carried her through those gates like it had done this 1,000 times before. She had. Every anniversary. Every birthday. Every time the weight became too heavy to hold alone. The grave was in the older section, away from the main paths. The headstone bore the name Marcus Sullivan and the dates that bracketed his impossibly short life. 12 years of marriage. That was all the time they got. 12 years before a drunk driver at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday decided to run a red light on I-25 and stole everything she'd planned to build with him. She knelt in the mud, rain soaking through her jacket, and pressed her forehead against the cold granite. Her voice came out broken, fractured into pieces she couldn't reassemble. I tried to disappear, she whispered. To be small and quiet and safe, and I still failed. I couldn't even help one man without losing everything again. I promised you I'd be okay, Marcus. I promised I'd build a life where I didn't have to carry that weight anymore. Where helping people didn't come with a price tag. She sat down hard in the mud beside the grave, rain running down her face, mixing with tears she didn't remember starting to shed. I'm not okay. I don't know how to be okay anymore. The cemetery was empty. The rain answered with its own language, hammering against stone, running in rivulets across names of the dead. Somewhere in the city beyond the gates, Hargrove was probably pouring himself a drink, confident that he'd handled a problem cleanly. The investigator was already composing her final report. The board members were adjusting their schedules, erasing Brooke's case from their mental files, moving on to the next agenda item. Back at Mercy General, in a basement office that nobody visited, Rodriguez watched the security footage on his screen and made a decision. He was a Marine Corps veteran himself, 2 tours in Fallujah, 2 years doing IT work when the knees gave out and the deployments ended. He recognized what he was looking at. He recognized the woman in the footage performing a procedure with surgical precision that no civilian nurse should possess. He recognized the protocol violation that was actually a life-saving action. He recognized a warrior who decided to be invisible and had paid for it with everything. He copied the footage. Every frame. The needle decompression. The hiss of air. The O2 climbing. The moment Hargrove and the investigator stood in the hallway discussing which footage should be accidentally deleted to protect the hospital from liability. The moment Hargrove's gloved hand reached into Brooke's personnel file and removed pages, deliberately, consciously, with the casual certainty of someone who knew no one would stop him. Rodriguez compiled it all onto a flash drive and locked it in his drawer. He didn't know what would happen next. He just knew that some people didn't get to disappear, no matter how hard they tried. Some people had a way of being found. On the drive home from the cemetery, Brooke's phone buzzed. A text from Jake, her 17-year-old son. Mom, I found something in the attic. We need to talk. She stared at the message for a long time, rain streaming down the windshield, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Jake had never been in the attic. They'd lived in the house for 5 years and he'd never mentioned the attic. Which meant someone had sent him there. Which meant something was about to break open that she'd spent 3 years, 5 months, and 2 weeks trying to keep sealed. The next morning, Brooke's phone rang at 6:36 a.m. Not her personal line. The other one. The phone she'd buried in a lockbox under her mattress 3 years ago, the one with a Pentagon direct line she'd never expected to use again. She stared at it for 2 full rings before answering. No greeting. No preamble. Just a voice like a tank idling in a garage. Senior Chief, this is Commander Price. We need to talk about what's happening at Mercy General. We already know. We've known since he arrived in the ER. The paralyzed veteran, the one 5 doctors had abandoned, wasn't just a broken Special Forces operator. He was a key witness in a classified Pentagon investigation. A federal investigation. Which meant the Navy had been quietly monitoring his hospital care the entire time. Which meant someone had sent him there deliberately. Which meant Brooke's needle decompression hadn't just saved a life. It had exposed a federal crime in progress. Within 90 minutes, 2 figures in dark suits walked into Mercy General's administrative wing. The FBI agent, young, composed, the kind of woman who'd seen classified things that never made the news, found Dr. Hargrove in his office and closed the door. Through the frosted glass partition, his silhouette jerked upright. His hands went to his throat. The agent's voice never rose above conversational. "Doctor, the patient you refuse to treat has been under federal protection since arrival. Your termination of the nurse who saved his life constitutes obstruction of a federal witness. That's a felony." But that wasn't the worst part. At 9:23 a.m., the hospital's IT specialist, a former Marine Corps sergeant named Rodriguez with a Purple Heart on his personnel file that nobody at Mercy General had thought to check, walked into the administrator's office carrying a flash drive the size of a thumbnail. His hands were steady. His voice was steady. He placed it on the mahogany desk with the precision of a man laying down a sword. "Every frame," he said. "Security footage from every camera in this hospital. The ones Dr. Hargrove tried to delete from the server logs. Including the hallway outside personnel. Including the moment he opened Brooke Sullivan's file and inserted false compliance violation records. Including the timestamps. Including the moment he did it deliberately." The administrator's face went white. The board members seated around the conference table, the same board members Hargrove had called in favors from, the same ones who'd nodded when he said the paralyzed veteran was a liability, suddenly developed very urgent emails that required their immediate attention. Rodriguez didn't stop. "I also have his call logs to the outside investigator he hired. Payment records showing he paid that investigator $47,000 to fabricate violations in her file. And I have his text messages to the 3 board members threatening to release their malpractice cover-ups if they didn't support his termination decision." Rodriguez slid a printed document across the desk. "I'm filing a formal whistleblower report with the Department of Veterans Affairs and the FBI. Everything's in here. Names. Dates. Dollar amounts. All of it." The Marine vet walked out without waiting for a response. Muscle memory took over. He saluted nobody in particular, just a fist to his chest, the old way, and left. At 10:15 a.m., the hospital administrator's office door burst open. Commander Price walked through it like he owned the building, dress uniform pristine, ribbon stacked on his chest like a library of violence. Beside him stood the paralyzed veteran, stable now, moving with careful deliberation but moving under his own will. The commander's eyes found Hargrove first. They were the color of a stormy Atlantic, the kind of gaze that had looked down the length of rifle scope and never flinched. "That woman," Price said, pointing one finger at Hargrove without moving closer, "ran a forward surgical unit under fire for 18 months in Helmand Province. 43 operators. She saved 43 of us. Including me. She holds a Navy Cross. That decoration doesn't go to people who quit, Doctor. It goes to people who run toward the fire." Price's voice stayed level. It never raised. That made it worse. "You tried to destroy a Medal of Honor recipient to protect your board appointment. That's not just a crime. That's obscene." Hargrove's face drained of color. His hand shook. He tried to speak. The words died. That was when Jake appeared in the doorway, 17 years old, carrying a heavy wooden box with both hands like it weighed more than just wooden metal. His face was set with the kind of focus Brooke would recognize, the focus of a young man who'd finally been trusted with the truth. He walked straight to the administrator's desk and set the box down with deliberate care. His voice was clear. It carried through the entire office and into the hallway beyond. "Mom, they need to see these. I found them in the attic. Dad saved them all these years." Jake opened the box. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then a young nurse, barely older than Jake, filing papers in the corner, a nurse who'd worked alongside Brooke for 3 years without knowing who she really was, gasped. Her hands went to her mouth. Her voice trembled as she leaned forward, reading the inscriptions on the medals with the reverence of someone holding sacred things, Bronze Star with Valor. She paused. Swallowed. Silver Star. Another pause, longer. 2 purple hearts. Her eyes widened. She turned to the commendation letters and her voice cracked as she read aloud, each word hitting the room like a shot, for exceptional valor under fire. For saving the lives of wounded operators while under direct enemy attack. For maintaining field hospital operations during a 72-hour siege. For extraordinary medical skill and leadership. She looked up at Jake, then at the medals, then at the gathered administrators and board members. A Navy Cross. The last medal sat in the center of the box. The blue ribbon. The gold anchor. The seal of the United States Navy. The 3rd highest decoration for valor that could be awarded to anyone in uniform. It caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like a star. Hargrove's knees buckled. He sat down hard in his office chair. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Senior Chief Sullivan earned that decoration, Commander Price said quietly, by being braver than everyone in this room combined. She earned the right to refuse patients, to ignore protocols, to break rules if it meant saving a life. And you fired her because she actually did the thing you spent your entire career pretending to be capable of doing. She put someone else's life before her own career. The FBI agent was back in the doorway now, and with him came hospital security and 2 federal marshals. They moved toward Hargrove with the mechanical efficiency of people who'd done this before. One of them was reading rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. But Brooke wasn't in this office. She was sitting in her car in the Mercy General parking lot, staring at her phone, watching the text messages and emails pour in. The hospital offered reinstatement with back pay. A formal apology. A promotion to charge nurse. All of it dated within the last 2 hours. All of it too late. Because Brooke had already said yes to someone else. Across Denver, a Denver Regional Teaching Hospital, they'd been expecting her. The director of nursing had already prepared the office. The Veterans Rehabilitation Unit had been waiting for a leader who understood what broken looked like, who could recognize the difference between physical paralysis and the kind that lived in the nervous system and never went away. They'd offered her exactly what Mercy General never could, a chance to stop hiding. She didn't call back. She drove to her new office and stood in the doorway, looking at the empty desk, the empty shelves, the window that overlooked a rehabilitation gym where 3 veterans in various stages of recovery worked with physical therapists. In 6 weeks, she would fill this space with the unit patch. The commendation letters. The photos of the operators she'd saved. She would hang her Navy Cross on the wall and let people ask questions. She would be seen. But first, the paralyzed veteran appeared in her doorway like he'd been waiting for permission to exist. His name was Mason. His eyes were clear. His hands held something small and faded, a unit patch, worn thin by years in a pocket, sewn once with military precision into the lining of a jacket. The same patch. I recognized this, he said, his voice carrying the weight of recognition. The day you were holding my chest and pushing air back into my lungs, I saw this patch sewn inside your jacket lining. Same unit I carried through Kandahar. Same unit patch that got me here in the first place. Brooke took it. The fabric was soft from handling, the embroidery barely holding. She ran her thumb over it the way she'd done 1,000 times before, the way her dead husband had done when he wore it, the way she'd done every time she thought about walking away. I thought, Brooke said quietly, if I hid who I was, I could outrun what I saw. I was wrong. Mason nodded slowly. He understood what that meant. He'd tried the same thing. You can't outrun it, he said. But you can use it. You can turn it into something that saves people instead of haunting them. Through the window, they watched a young Marine Corps veteran take his first careful steps after spinal surgery. His physical therapist, Rodriguez, the IT specialist, who'd transferred to the unit because he couldn't stay at a place that had broken what he believed in, stood beside him with the patient presence of a man who understood the specific terror of learning to move again. Another veteran watched from the parallel bars, waiting her turn, breathing through the kind of mental pain that didn't show on imaging. A third sat in a wheelchair, hands trembling around a cup of water like it might explode, eyes unfocused but present. Jake appeared in the hallway with 2 coffees. He was 17, and something in him had grown older in the last 48 hours. Something had also grown clearer. He handed the coffee to his mother and looked at Mason without judgment. "She saved you." "Yes," Mason said simply. "She did." "She'll save others too," Jake said. It wasn't a question. Margaret walked past the office, the OR nurse who'd recognized what Brooke's hands could do before anyone else understood. She'd transferred too. She'd left Mercy General the moment she heard about the termination, walking out in the middle of a shift with nothing but her badge and her integrity. She waved at Brooke from the hallway, moving toward the rehabilitation gym where a veteran was starting to lose it. Panic attack, flashback, the kind of crisis that nobody could understand except someone who'd been there. Margaret knew. She'd been there. She'd been standing with the 82nd Airborne when the world went sideways. That afternoon, Brooke received an encrypted message from a secure military email address. It came from Commander Price. It read, "3 more operators need what you gave that one. When you're ready. No timeline. We'll wait." She saved the message. She didn't delete it. 6 months passed like a timeline montage of everything Hargrove had lost. His medical license, suspended and then revoked pending criminal investigation for evidence tampering, intimidation, and obstruction of a federal witness. His upcoming board appointment, withdrawn. His marriage, dissolved when his wife realized what he'd done and how much federal prison time it would carry. His house, foreclosed when the legal fees consumed everything. His reputation, scattered into 1,000 fragments that could never be reassembled. He ended up at a folding table in a strip mall on the east side of Denver, selling supplemental insurance policies. No medical license meant no hospital credentials, meant no future in medicine. Just a man in a loosened tie, hands shaking slightly as he tried to smile at potential customers who mostly walked past without stopping. A stack of pamphlets in front of him. A plastic water bottle he refilled from a bathroom tap. Fluorescent lights overhead that made him look like a ghost of himself. Brooke drove past that strip mall on her way to work one Tuesday morning. She didn't slow down. She barely glanced at the window. But for just a moment, she saw him clearly, the man who'd tried to erase her, who'd knocked her tray to the floor, who'd bet $50 she'd quit within a week. He looked smaller now. Diminished. The way people do when the world finally sees what they really are. She kept driving. Her new office overlooked the rehabilitation gym. The walls were painted a soft sage green. 3 windows let in morning light that fell across photos of operators she'd saved, faces she could finally display without hiding. The Navy Cross hung on the wall in its glass case, the ribbon catching light the way it had in that wooden box. The unit patch, framed now, sat beside it. A photo of her late husband in dress uniform occupied the corner of her desk, the first time she'd allowed herself to display his face at work. Mason appeared in her doorway at 7:52 a.m. on a Wednesday. He was walking with braces now, a cane in his right hand, the kind of progress that should have taken months but somehow happened in weeks because he had a model who understood what impossible recovery felt like. He held something in his hands like it might break. The faded unit patch. Not framed. Not displayed. Just the actual patch, worn and soft, the one from inside her jacket lining. "I wanted to return this to you," Mason said. "Because I recognized it. Because it meant something to you. And because I figured you should have it back now that you don't have to hide anymore." Brooke took it. The fabric was almost gossamer thin now, the edges starting to fray. She could feel 3 years of a dead man's hands on it, and 18 months of her own desperate fingers touching it every time she thought about surrendering to invisibility. She ran her thumb across the embroidery one final time, then turned to her office wall and found a space of white wall that seemed to wait for exactly this. She didn't frame it. She pinned it directly to the wall, the way a real operator would, the way it was meant to be worn. The patch sat between the Navy Cross and her husband's photograph. 3 things that meant the same word in different languages: presence. Evidence. "I was there." "Thank you," Brooke said to Mason, "for giving me permission to stop running." Through the window, a young Army Ranger took his first steps in the rehabilitation gym, and his legs shook, and his eyes were somewhere in Fallujah that he couldn't get back from. Brooke recognized that look. She'd worn it herself. She'd spent 3 years trying to outrun it and failing. She stood up from her desk. She walked into the gym with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. The ranger saw her coming and flinched, some kind of authority figure, maybe, or just the reminder that eyes were on him, judging his failure to walk normally. But Brooke knelt beside him in a movement that had nothing to do with professionalism and everything to do with understanding. "I know where you are," she said quietly. Her hands were steady on his shoulders, hands that had held lives together in minefield dust, hands that had performed nerve mappings in secret, hands that had performed a needle decompression that changed everything. "I've been there. I've seen what you've seen. And I'm going to help you find your way back." The ranger's eyes met hers. Something in them recognized something in her. Recognition, not sympathy. Experience, not pity. He breathed. He tried again. This time his legs held. The light through the rehabilitation gym windows fell golden and honest across the floor. In that light, 5 people worked toward healing. A young Marine with a transfer of the heart and the strength of a soldier. A former Army medic who'd given up everything to help. A paralyzed veteran who'd learned that broken doesn't mean stopped. A Navy nurse who'd finally stopped hiding. A teenager who'd learned that heroism sometimes looks like carrying a box of medals into a room and speaking truth loudly enough that people had no choice but to listen. True class is what you do when the lights go out. And these lights were shining very bright now. Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.